One. We're recording this session as Zoom just let you know. We have also enabled a live transcript for closed captioning, and you may find that option on the control bar that usually appears at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're extending the warmest welcome to the third ASLE Spotlight in this series on the topic of multi-species connections. I'm Nate Otjen, Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at Raymond College. I study how narratives either limit or open up possibilities for multi-species justice, and I'm especially interested in life writing as a genre. For those of you joining an ASLE event for the first time, a special welcome to you. We're so glad you've joined today and invite you to help sustain and further our work by becoming an ASLE member if you are not already part of this association. ASLE acknowledges its office is located on Indakina, the ancestral and unceded homeland of the Abenaki people, along the Quinituka and Ashuelot watersheds and in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. We recognize that this land has been cared for by the Abenaki for at least 12,600 years, including by the Sokoke, Pennacook, and other Wabanaki peoples. ASLE offers this statement as a way of affirming its commitment to recognizing and supporting Native history and culture in the Monadnock region, and for all regions where our members and officers dwell, past, present, and future. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this event with Mildred Kiconco Barya.
Thank you so much, Ned. And as you've just said, my name is Mildred Kiconco Barya, and I write poetry, creative nonfiction, and fiction. I'm excited to be with you all. And I'm going to mention a few things about the Spotlights and ASLE's leadership, which launched this series in 2021 to elevate the work of our members in creative writing, scholarship, public engagement, and stuff like that. We're so excited to continue to foster connections with new audiences through the Spotlights. And also a little bit about logistical information. The most important is that please stay on mute while we are having this conversation so that we don't hear whatever sound might be in your background. And we will give our fullest attention to the presenters. And afterwards, we will have some time for questions from the audience. So if you already plan to ask a question or you get a question while listening to the presenters, please feel free to write it in the chat and post the question. And try to keep it as concise as possible because we have such a short time together. But we'll be able to see it in the chat and get to it when we open up the questions for the audience. And without spending more time, I'm just going to introduce our first presenters. And the first presenters we have is John Yunker and Midge Raymond. They are co-authors of Animal Rights and also co-founders of Ashland Creek Press, which is a vegan-owned small press devoted to environmental and animal literature. So, John and Midge, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Mildred. It's
Thank you.
wonderful to be here today. And animal rights is a very hands-on guide for writers. I'm going to take a step back and talk about what brought it about, which was Writing for Animals, which was a book that came before this. And as publishers, one thing that Midge and I, have been very passionate about is working to elevate the practice of writing about animals, which is why we publish Writing for Animals, because we believe that writers have enormous power through the written word to either help or harm animals. And we've seen both over the years in literature. And so what I'm going to do is just read a few paragraphs from the introduction to Writing for Animals to give you an idea of why this all came about. So I will get started there. So to begin with, and this is from the introduction. The more we study animals, the smarter they get. Whales, we now know, communicate in complex languages over hundreds of miles, are curious, playful, and highly social, and can recognize themselves and others in a mirror. We know that sharks can sense how fast your heart is beating, and a polar bear can smell you from 20 miles away. Crows remember human faces, craft tools, and have long relied on the tires of passing cars as their personal nutcrackers. Bumblebees, like our companion animals, can be taught to pull strings and push balls in exchange for treats. Thanks to the efforts of professional and citizen scientists, we know so much more about animals than we knew just a generation ago. Yet, despite all we've learned, we have a long way to go when it comes to appreciating what animals can do. Because the skill set of a whale or a bumblebee doesn't position that animal for success in a hospital or on Wall Street. Our society continues to view and treat non human animals as lesser creatures. Writers in all media, from fiction to film, bear some responsibility for our collective ignorance and mistreatment of animals. Nothing makes me cringe more in a story when I see animals used as mere props or set pieces. A man falls off a boat into the ocean, so cue the shark to elicit fear out of the reader, even though the fact is sharks rarely attack people. Bears and wolves all too often suffer the same fate. They are pulled into the story when the writer needs an easy way to crank up the tension. Consider the long-term impact of so many writers treating so many animals similarly. A planet of people who do not shed tears when sharks have their fins removed or when wolves are killed to protect cattle, who themselves are slaughtered by the billions at the hands of humans. Other misconceptions commonly propagated by writers include pigs are messy, fish don't feel pain, horses enjoy running with humans on their backs. Even the words and phrases we use have a collective subconscious impact. Pigsty, like a beached whale, kill two birds with one stone, don't be a chicken. Through their work and their art, writers have the power to give animals a voice among humans. Yet, if we give animals a lesser voice or an inauthentic voice, we do animals a disservice. For society to change its views, writers must change their views. We must look closely at how we depict animals and ask ourselves difficult questions. For example, are we using animals for our writing in a way that is authentic and fair? Or are we using them for our own purposes, leading to further misconceptions and abuses? Animals have, both in literature and in life, been unfairly used by humans for millennia. Yet, as our awareness wakens about animals' intelligence, sensitivity, and capacity for such quote unquote human emotions as love, grief, and joy, literature too is reflecting this change in awareness. From Franz Kafka's A Report to the Academy to Karen Joy Fowler's We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, animals have played an increasingly central role in the literature of the last 100 years, and writers are contributing to this advancing awareness of animal issues through the written word, giving animals the voices they deserve. Yet little has been written about the process of writing about animals, from crafting point of view to giving animals realistic voices. Writers face many questions and choices in their work, from how to educate without being didactic to how to develop animals as characters for an audience that still views them as ingredients. What is the role of the writer in this age, the Anthropocene, in a time when the world has been forever changed by humans? We can begin to change it for the better. The way humans treat non-human animals has significant impacts not only on our psyches, but on the planet itself. We invite writers to imagine a world in which there is less suffering, more justice, purer water, cleaner air, and each of these things is connected in some way to the way we treat animals for food, for entertainment, for resources. We invite writers to imagine our similarities with our non-human counterparts rather than our differences. And finally, we invite writers to use their talents to show these things to the world. So that should give you just a bit of an understanding of writing for animals and by extension animal rights and what we're advocating for. Midge, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And John took a step back to read from Writing for Animals. So I'll just step back forward into animal rights to say that one thing we ended up doing during the pandemic was starting a class, a program, Writing for Animals, in which we use the book as a text and writers come together to talk about the craft of writing for animals. We read. and do a lot of writing around all the things that John just mentioned. And that's where animal rights came from. It came directly out of the class and creating prompts for these issues and these genres in which we can write for animals. I mean, there are mystery novels, there's poetry, there's so many ways we can advocate for animals in literature in ways that'll really, really connect with readers, across the globe. So that's where we are, and it's been a wonderful community, and we are so heartened to see so many people, so many writers who are interested in advocating for writers in their work. So it's been very exciting.
Thank you so much for that, Midge and John. It sounds like there needs to be a second iteration of this workshop in the future, or maybe more than that. It's a fantastic project. So
Thank you.
next one we're going to hear from Boria Sachs, who teaches at Sing Sing in the Graduate English Program of Mercy University. He's the author of 20 books, which have been widely translated.
Hi. Hi. Um, the Chinese sage Zhuangzhao once wrote that he had dreamed he was a butterfly fluttering over a field. Suddenly he woke up. Was he, Zhuangzhao asked, really a man who dreamt he was a butterfly? Was he a butterfly dreaming he was a man? Now, I use this as the foundation of my book. I don't always refer to it, but it's in the background. The anthropologist Philippe Descola has a theory of four basic cultural ontologies: animism, totemism, analogism, and naturalism. Using this, at the beginning, I ask the reader to imagine an academic conference devoted to the question of whether Zhuangzhao is a butterfly or a man. And I also imagine that we've developed the art of time travel so we can invite anybody, any place, in any era. I invite a pre-Columbian indigenous person, an Australian indigenous person, a Renaissance philosopher, and an early modern scientist at the beginning, and they debate from their respective ontologies whether Zhuang Zhao is a man or a butterfly. Now, actually the publisher asked me to write this. When I sent the initial manuscript in, they thought, oh my God, this is kind of weird. And they asked for a lot of extensive cuts, and they didn't understand this and they didn't understand that. And I told them, no, it's all of one piece. It can't be cut. And so, I'll revise it to make it clearer, but that's all. And I did. But when I revised it, I added an epilogue that goes even further in combining traditional scholarship and something like fiction. I included a continuation of the conference in which the various people who I discuss take part. So I put short speeches by um, uh, Emily Dickinson and Franz Kafka and uh, Albrecht Dürer, Johannes Schwammerdam, Maria Sibylla Merian, and others. And finally, who should appear but Zhuang Zhao himself. So, next slide, please. Now, in this picture, you have This is the Madonna of the Rose Gardens. The Madonna and the Christ Child are placing garlands on various people who are participating. On the left is the Pope, on the right is the Holy Roman Emperor. But nobody is looking at the Madonna, and nobody is looking at the Christ Child. The Pope and the Emperor are both looking at Mary's shift, where you can see right in the center of the painting, just near Christ's feet, a fly. And even Mary is looking at the fly. But nobody seems irritated or angry or disgusted or anything of the sort. So what gives? Well, I think Dürer was trying to show how observing the natural world is a key to the same cosmology as we find in religion. At the time, people believed that insects were spontaneously generated from dirt, which is actually a little like the Immaculate Conception, and it also like the original creation of the world from nothing, including Adam and Eve. And so they are effectually venerating Mary and Christ through the fly in the center. Next slide. Okay, the illustrator J.J. Granville would often take a text with one perspective and then illustrate it with another. In the text, two gentlemen strolling along the pathway see a beautiful carnation and they think, let's domesticate it, let's take it home. That's from their perspective. The carnation sees things otherwise, and that's what the illustration shows. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to read briefly from the part of my chapter on Emily Dickinson. Innumerable means of communication are found among animals and plants. Birds communicate by calls and songs, chameleons and octopuses by changing color, fireflies by flashing their lights and codes, ants by releasing pheromones, bees with a dance. Trees communicate by releasing chemicals or sending electrical impulses through their roots. Human beings can spontaneously enjoy much of this communication, since the patterns made by light from fireflies in the evening, but deciphering it is another matter. Scientists generally attempt to reduce communication in the natural world to very simple messages. The male cicadas are trying to attract a female. The crows are warning about the approach of a hawk. The bee is announcing the location of flowers. We try, in other words, to translate them exclusively into the most simple instrumental terms. But the messages may actually be a lot more subtle and nuanced. The usual way of decoding natural communication is like a computer translation of a poem by Hölderlin or Mallarmé into English. We are, in other words, filtering out the subjectivity and claiming it for ourselves as human beings. But what would the messages be like in a translation that would include not only objectives, but also the accompanying subjectivity? while even elucidating implicit philosophical and religious implications. It would be closer to poetry than to prose, perhaps like the poems of Emily Dickinson. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've given us lots to think about there. Thank you. So we will have our next presentation, and it's going to be from Lesley Wheeler, whose sixth poetry collection is Mycocosmic. Her work appears in Orion, Poetry, Poets and Writers, and Ecoton. She is the poetry editor of Shenandoah. Lesley, you're welcome.
Thanks so much, Mildred. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. So, and thanks to all my wonderful panelists, to Nate, to Amy, and everybody from ASLE who probably worked on putting together this Spotlight series behind the scenes. One thing you learn from writing for a while, that everything is a collaboration, right? And sometimes we don't see our collaborators. I also want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on Monacan land in Virginia. Speaking from and about this recent poetry collection that you see pictured on the slide, Mycocosmic, that is a made-up word, so you can pronounce it however you like. But the prefix myco refers to fungal life, and that's what I'm going to stress in this brief presentation. And Tupelo Press, by the way, has kindly provided a discount code of 30% on this book, by the way, and thanks to Amy for putting that in the chat. Frankly, I didn't know much about fungal life, say 12 years ago, which is when what some call the interdisciplinary fungal turn really started happening, when there was a lot more sort of writing and thinking about fungal life, and acknowledging how much we're in constant bodily conversation with it. Even though, as far as a branch of biology, we know relatively little about it. I was encountering it through science journalism, occasionally dipping further and reading scientific articles. But of course, it's there in creative nonfiction and fiction and film too. I was particularly fascinated by mycorrhizal networks, the existence of a social underworld that's mostly invisible, of partnerships between flora and fungi. And as I learning more about fauna and fungi as well, I was just as amazed to learn about fungus and bacteria in the human microbiome, that while imbalances leading to illness get more attention, fungus has beneficial roles too, that in lots of physiological processes, and that it also sometimes influences behavior. This blew up my sense of being an autonomous individual in a way that's been really good for me, I think. I think fungal connectivity is in itself beautiful, that radical interdependence that it reveals. Reading about it changed me in part by giving me access to awe. I'm very drawn to the hope that a lot of mycologists express for fungal remediation of damaged spaces. They're some of the most hopeful scientists I know. And I think that the way that fungus can restore an ecosystem, it can restore a person spiritually and psychologically by helping us imagine better relationships among humans and the more than human world. I often write poetry inspired by science, so this material was infiltrating my work when a personal cataclysm hit. My mother became ill and died just 5 years ago. And of course, I was writing about her death and grief afterwards. I was surprised by another development in my writing, which was that I was suddenly spilling all kinds of family secrets that I hadn't realized that I had been refusing to surface those things in myself because of my mother's readership. experiences about family violence and mental health and gender and sexuality, I gradually realized that, all of these things were connected. I still didn't know how it was all going to be in the same book, until I realized that fungus, like bacteria, metabolizes death, and that's what I needed to do. I needed to transform grief into nourishment. Um, the final brainstorm was to write what I ended up calling an underpoem in the book. And you have that pictured on the slide there, the first lines of it. The way that it's laid out in the book is, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a line at a time in a different font, continuous verse essay that runs along the sort of understory of the book. And what I was doing there was trying to mimic mycelium and thinking about how a poem might move fungally. Thinking about how hyphae, for example, the fungal threads, filaments, branch and weave around obstacles as they're trying to make the connections that feed them as well as feeding other life. I'm going to close by reading one shorter poem from the book because the underpoem, it runs through the whole book. It's quite long. And it's about how a species of cordyceps influences ant behavior. It's one of those relationships that I think people have heard of most often. So this is called Carpenter Ant with Zombie Fungus. Oh, and it does move to thinking about how fungal life might be influencing me too. Some days the soil spits up toys and teeth of broken glass, clay scent and green insinuation. Beneath, within, hyphae fizz with information, phosphorus for the river birch answered by food converted from light. Maybe what seemed haunted is involuted. Here in the little yard where I did not mean to confine my life, quietness gives acoustic space not just to leashed dogs speaking their hearts, not just to wrens and the outraged catbird with her score of scolding tones, but to a rumble I can almost feel and chemical signals I may respond to before I mean to, the way a word of wonder leaps from my tongue without leave. Mycorrhizal conversations, brightly intimate seams spiking through me, the way a fungal fruiting body erupts from an ant's head. Mycelium knows some things about what the dogwood strain for, undercover, and what I dream, world I can't call mine, branching and blooming in the sense of choosing among histories and futures, always present, all at once, commensally. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Lesley. So I'm going to introduce our final speaker here. We're going to hear from Lei Xiong-Ng, an assistant professor of American literature at the English department at Sophia University, Japan. Lei, it's all yours.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Yes. So you can just call me Lei. And first of all, I want to thank ASLE Spotlight for having me as one of the panelists today. So today I'm going to introduce my first monologue, which is called Hemingway, Ecology and Culture, Rereading Hemingway in the Anthropocene, published by Bloomsbury Academic in October 2025. And it is also open access, by the way. Next slide, please. So I will give you a brief background of Hemingway. So Hemingway loved hunting, fishing, traveling, and writing. And his hunting activities has been viewed as having a conqueror mentality towards the land and an aggressive and isolated individualisms. And his persona as the papa, hyper-masculine marlin chasing, began hunting man of actions in the public eyes makes it kind of difficult to approach his work from the ecological lens. However, his writing also consists of an increasing awareness towards the environment and an ethics of care. And therefore, beneath this iconic image of Papa Hemingway, I also see a careful environmental thinker. Next slide, please. So, as Ford McDowell notes, Hemingway's works strike you, each one, as if they were pebbles fresh from a brook. They live and shine, each in its place. So his respect for nature and sensitivity towards animal suffering are actually evidenced throughout his literature and personal correspondence. And this sensitivity was actually cultivated through his reading of naturalist works, outdoor magazines, and scientific texts on wildlife, followed by hands-on experiences with his father when he was young. His father taught him to respect animals he killed and utilize them fully. And these experiences foster empathy and critical examination of the act of killing and compelling him to consider animals' importance beyond just games. So, in our current era of increasing commodification of nature and body parts, I think re-evaluations of Hemingway's literature become important. And next slide, please. So, about this book. This is the, as I say, first monograph emphasized the voices of the underrepresented non-human matter in Hemingway's work from the lens of environmental humanities, or more specifically, material eco-criticisms. So there are three main benefits offered by this book project. First, it unveils a multi-dimensional Hemingways, whereby I explore a new side of him beyond just the Papa stereotype. And second, it combines Hemingway studies and material eco-criticisms. And third, Hemingway's ecological ambivalence may challenge our own views on the environment, encouraging us to actually rethink our role in the Anthropocene. So in short, it fosters environmental consciousness and self-reflections. Next slide, please. Okay, so this becomes a little bit academic, so please bear with me. Just gonna introduce, the outline of the books. The structure is based on the four basic elements we have in the West: the earth, the air, the water, and the fire. So chapter 1 explores the representation of rotten food and the body, the rotten landscape, and the Gothic rain through an eco-Gothic perspective in A Farewell to Arms. Chapter 2 examines the rolling earth, the screaming earth, dirt in For Whom the Bell Tolls from the lens of earth ethics. And chapter 3, I look into the old man, which is Santiago, his sensory perceptions in The Old Man and the Sea, uncovering the ecology of colors within these absolutely colorful works. And chapter 4 turns to the transcorporeality of smell in For Whom the Bell Tolls, reviewing how smell is actually essential for understanding the characters and body experiences. And chapter 5, I explore the vitalisms of death in the snows of Kilimanjaro and a natural history of the dead, reviewing how the decompositions of human and non-human bodies in this text can be seen as intra-active, challenging the reductive, commercialized notion of death. All right, as for fire, so we often think of fire as destructive, right? But fire is also restorative in this sense. So I look into this, and this aspect of the restorative fire is reviewed in Big Two Heart River. And then the next chapter, I employ the perspective of environmental history in the East Africa and animal sentience to explore the unseen fire of destructions within the main characters, David, in his African narrative. And I suggest that David rewriting of the African story later when he grew up actually emphasize a non-anthropocentric masculinity, which I view as a form of restorative fire. All right, finally, I revisit Hemingway's ecological ambivalence by drawing upon his biography and the previous chapters to offer a reading of his major work as a form of cultural ecology. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Leigh, for that perspective into reading Hemingway. And thank you, everybody who's already presented, Boria, John, and Midge, and Lesley. So we're going to try and put all your work into conversation, which is really a great task. But one of the things that cut across, I think there is something you're all doing with the theme of transformation, whether that happens in the reader encountering somebody else's work, or whether it happens in meeting nature and having conversations with nature, which is why we're here today to talk about these multi-species connections. So the first question that is addressed to all of you is if you could please talk about how relations with multi-species or connections with the more than human world have transformed your thinking and way of being in the world. And in your response to this question, you're encouraged to address personal changes or what we might call spiritual shifts or awakenings that may be shaping your approaches to work, writing, or the living world itself. And Leigh, you still have the spotlight, so we could really begin with you, if you don't mind.
Oh, it's gonna I start first? Okay, sure. So it's about how for me, it's about how studying Hemingway's and also put into the material eco-criticisms and how it transformed my personal life. And in practice, I actually become more aware of my own ecological ambivalence, as I call it. Uh, I give you a very simple example. It's like a quiet conflict I feel when choosing between environmental friendly options or just the more economical ones. So we actually encounter this in the daily basics. And I'm glad to say that the former increasingly wins in this case. And this tension, small as it seems, actually reflects something larger. And it's like the gaps between knowing and doing that I think many of us carry and that Hemingway's own characters carry as well. Um, and also, I start donating money to environmental organizations such as Jungle Keepers every month to help protect the Amazon rainforest. So this is something I did. I started to do, yeah, after get into the multi-species studies, and it also reflects on how I teach. For example, I started to use texts like uh, Patience Rogers' Not, also James Wright, Blessings, and also Tune of Tuna Fish from Literature and the Environment, which is like a textbook edited by Lauren Anderson, Scott Slovics, and John P. O'Grady, and alongside with some Japanese Buddhist eco philosophy like Mottainai, which is like don't waste things, and also Komorebi before, and after we going through all of these texts, I asked my student to compose essay to actually locate their own voices within environmental discourse. I have more example. Can I share?
Yes.
Or am I talking too much? Daijoubu? Okay. So another example is that I got an inspiration um, from Zoe Scolding. Uh, and she wrote a book. It's called A Revolutionary Calendar, published in 2020. It's actually include 360 poems drawn from plants, animals, and agriculture implements in the French Republican calendars. And I found this like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. So I incorporated in my course, and I asked my students to create their own versions of their own revolutionary calendar to pushing back against what they find oppressive or problematic in the society they feel connected with the most. So in this case, it's either Japanese society or some of the students actually study in the US before, or came from the US, and it would be Japanese and American societies. Yeah. And many told me that this process actually make them more conscious of their ties to the non-human world, which is to me is the whole point. Uh, and yeah, should I keep going?
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you. I'm glad you
Okay.
had all these examples to give us. And anybody can jump in at this moment. I don't have to keep calling on somebody to respond, but whoever is ready, I see Lesley putting her hand up. So, yes, go for it.
Yeah, I'm going to give a much more tentative response to that, which is I'm still figuring it out. That I there was a moment, and I'm pretty sure this was a pandemic moment, that I was standing in the yard of my 115-year-old house here in Virginia. When I moved in, there were three tall maple trees, very old, and two of them swiftly went down. One of them was hit by a derecho that hit Virginia and knocked down a lot of maple trees in the area. And another just rotted from the inside. And so I'm standing in my yard by the one remaining maple tree. And I had been reading about mycorrhizal connections. And I started thinking, did this tree, was it in communication with those other maple trees? And if so, is it lonely? And I there was this sort of mental explosion where or this cascade where I kept thinking, what would that be like? And then why am I thinking this right now? Am I in some kind of communication that I don't know I'm in? And it really wasn't very long after that that my sort of fungal poetry and also a novel that's currently under submission that has a lot to do with mycelial life, that underground life of the fungus. And so I don't know exactly what it's opened up for me besides attunement, paying a lot of attention. I know Mildred is an avid and skilled mushroom forager, and I'm much more amateur in that at that. But walking around the world in a state of greater imagination and more acute noticing. Fungal life is not flashy, right? Mushrooms rarely grab your attention the way, say, flowers do. So I'm thinking about that, also being inspired as a writer to think less about ambition or being flashy, that to think more about how we are all connected and everyone else's success is my success, that we're all sharing. So,
Right.
those kinds of humilities.
I think that's quite deep, and that's frankly everything because just attuning to that and tapping into your compassion and bringing empathy to the trees and things in the environment and having that sensitivity and tapping into the feeling, I feel that already makes me feel better about my day today. Yeah, so I would take that anytime, any day. Thank you so much for sharing it. And Boria, do you have something to share?
Yes, I my for me it was a very personal transformation. I
Mm,
spent a little over a decade as a uh, human rights activist. I was the regional coordinator for Amnesty International in Eastern Europe. And Amnesty International at that time was very different from the way it is now. It was basically a grassroots human rights organization divided into groups that would adopt prisoners. But I was um, every day reading all of these heartbreaking accounts of what people had experienced all over the world uh, when their human rights were neglected. And I finally reached a point where, honestly, I just couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know how to go on. Now, the reason why environmental concerns are so important in my work now is because I see this as connecting the human story with a much larger perspective, and a perspective where even the very deep abuses are underlaid by a sense of beauty. And it seems to me that we place much too much of a burden on humankind if we try to make it the sole focus for all our hopes and dreams and aspirations. So I'm trying to introduce people to a larger perspective and help them to appreciate the great uh, diversity and the color of life throughout the world and perhaps the cosmos. Now, one point on which, as a result of this, I might disagree with a lot of my colleagues. I'm pretty guarded about the idea of animal rights. And that is because it impresses me as a means of extending the human realm uh, into the natural world. And what I feel that I would like to do is rather uh, not project our concepts into the natural world, but to borrow from the natural world in our lives.
I like that angle, projecting or borrowing, or even how much of us are already into nature, since we are nature anyway, or are we nature anyway? That's something big to that we could unravel. We could stay here the next 4 hours, but I'll move to John and Midge and ask you to also respond to the relations, how your relations have changed. And because I'm trying to be mindful of time, and then we'll get to Ned's question. And also, I see some questions coming in into the chat, which are exciting. So hopefully we can get to those as well. So, John, do you have something to add or?
I'm going to pass it to Midge.
Okay.
Okay. Well, speaking for myself, and I think I speak a little bit for John here as well, because we have been on the same journey in terms of transforming into small press, co-founders and writers for animals. I think it was, I'll trace it back to a trip we took. This was more than 20 years ago to Antarctica. And for some reason, it took going to the very end of the earth to sort of see more clearly our place in the world. So for me, that was being among penguins, being among all the wildlife down there in a place that is so very pristine and so untouched by humans that it kind of put into perspective the impact we have on the earth. And for me, I related especially to the penguins and seeing that their world is in peril due to what we are doing on the rest of the planet just changed everything in my life. So from personally to professionally, I came back to the Northern Hemisphere, stopped eating animals, stopped wearing animals, using animals for anything, and started writing about them. And from then on, we went on to found Ashland Creek Press and start the Writing for Animals, a series of books and writing classes. And it's been a wonderful journey just to feel, to recognize animals, well, to recognize that we are animals and to recognize them as our fellow creatures on this planet and how we just all need to take care of one another, essentially. But I'm going to let everyone get to the questions that I see are coming up in the chat because I want to hear from everyone what they have to say.
Well, thank you. But I appreciate your response to how radical it can be and how some of these changes are subtle, but others are really radical. And it's like a whole 360 degrees turn. Nate, let's get to you and then the questions in the chat.
So I'm thinking, yeah, one way we could approach this, if everyone's okay with this, is I could ask my question, and then we can ask the questions in the chat, and you all can select which ones you want to respond to. We can just have like a final question celebration, I guess, where all of them are presented at once. And then maybe what I could do is ask my question. We can go through and look at the questions in the chat, and then if anyone else has questions that they haven't put in the chat and want to ask, we can do that, and then just have 5 or 6 minutes for everyone to respond. Good. So I was going to ask everybody just about the way that you're thinking about narrative and the act of writing itself as these kind of multi-species projects. Lesley, I think you said it really beautifully when you said that everything is a collaboration. Of course, you refer really broadly to the act of writing and also the act of reading for those of us who are doing, like Lay, who are doing the literary criticism work. And so I was wondering if you could each say a little bit more about how redefining who gets to count as a writer, who also gets to count as perhaps a reader in some ways, if you're thinking about reading with others at the same time, might reorganize some of our dominant understandings about what it means to be an author, to be a storyteller, and even to participate in something like literary studies or eco-criticism. So just thinking about what that kind of multi-species frame does to the way that we think about the act of writing and also the act of reading. So other questions that came up in the chat that folks were asking, Rebecca is curious about other terms and beyond the kind of clunky more than human, just other ways of framing and thinking. And I assume also just thinking about the power that a term can have. Let's see, Greg, you had asked Boria what your conclusion is to that question that you posed in the book that you started with, if you have an answer to that, or if you kind of get to that point at any point. Aisha had asked about whether or not John and Midge could talk a little bit about how to avoid sounding didactic when writing about these topics like animals or veganism. And I see there's some responses already coming in. And then also just thinking about that in terms of being an academic and doing that kind of critical analysis work. Let's see. And then Greg, you also asked a question to Lesley about whether you're talking to maple trees, and Lesley, you responded briefly. And then Greg, it looks like you also asked a question about Hemingway here for Lay. And I love the things still coming in about questions about ecological ambivalence. And if you think that, yeah, Hemingway, feel you met Hemingway through your work in the book, like getting to know an author. Are there other questions that folks have that they haven't had the chance to ask? Okay. If not, then please, panel, what do you think? Which ones select one or two and maybe take a minute or so to respond.
First of all, to Greg's question, the question of whether Zhuangzhao is a man or a butterfly is never resolved. Uh, a butterfly appears, but is it Zhuangzhao or not? We still don't know. And also, in response to your comments, I think that when we try to talk about uh, the relations between different species in literature, the topic is so broad that our usual divisions simply can't cope with it. They reduce literature too much to enable it to address such themes. So, as I said, in my own book, I broke down the division between fiction and scholarship somewhat. I also think that we need to think beyond the divisions between different academic fields, between biology and English and philosophy and so on and so forth, because these impose limitations that really render the project impossible. So I am not terribly enthusiastic about the idea of founding a new discipline ecology in literature or animals in literature. I've participated in such endeavors, but I'm wary of them because I would just, like us to talk about animals and, wherever it takes us, moving across boundaries between fields and genres and so on.
I love that. Thank you.
I can say in answer to Nate, your question that something writing fiction has taught me that I don't think I thought as much about as a poet. As a poet, I was very aware of not speaking for others or being very cautious about speaking for others. You can't write fiction without a deep imagination of other subject positions. And that has the novel that I have most recently been working on does imagine the perspective of fungal life in little bits and pieces with plural pronouns, right? But I'm not sure I can get there, but I think those acts of imagination across difference among human beings too, right? That those failures to imagine the perspectives of other people and other creatures are costing us a whole lot. And I agree that it's something that as John and Midge said, that it's something we need to be thinking an awful lot about, both with necessary caution, but also understanding how important stories are.
I'll just chime in and second that. Pronouns are really, really important. And I personally, I would love to see animals not referred to it in news articles for starters, and in literature secondarily. There are solid reasons for using it, but if writers can have an awareness of when to use that and when to be using a he or she referring to an animal, that would take us a long way, I think.
Mhm. I think that all of you are reminding me about the importance of just we're not speaking for or even necessarily about all the time. And doing the work of thinking about speaking with is a really powerful position. And one of the ways that we can do that, as Leslie's saying, right, is partly through imagination, partly through that kind of noticing that we've been hearing about too. Midge, I'm sorry, I just saw that you had unmuted for a second.
Oh, I just wanted to also thank Lesley for what she said, and you as well, Nate, by focusing on imagination and what Lesley had talked about, and I also want to thank Lay for her work. I'm really eagerly diving into her book. One of the examples that we use in our Writing for Animals class is from one of Hemingway's short stories, The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, in which he briefly goes into a lion's point of view in the moment after he's been shot. And it is just a stunning paragraph. And when I first read it, and this was like decades ago, when I first read this story, it struck me even then, and I've remembered it all this time because, again, as Leigh was saying, you're thinking Mr. Big Game Hunter here, but he has that moment of getting into that point of view, into that perspective, that is really, really remarkable. And I think the more we can all do that and use our imagination and our empathy to step into other creatures' paws, talons, feet, whatever it may be, just the better we'll all be for it.
Okay, should I jump in and to say something to Nathan questions for the second questions? I think from my interpretation, I think what you're really saying is that writing isn't just something human do about nature, but it's something that happens with or through non-human participants. And in that sense, I believe writing, or more specifically, rewriting, is itself multi-species negotiations, where human writers are always in dialogue with the non-human world that shapes them. And it is through actually not just writing, but rewriting, rethinking, and reprocessing, that only through this process that our awareness can be recultivated. And that cultivation, I believe, will lead to eventually positive behavior. Um, and because non-humans are co-author of meanings, they deserve credit for inspiration they give us. So I even have this idea that if every author plants a tree or contribute to environmental organization after publishing a book, and that act alone would actually symbolize a meaningful form of acknowledgement, like a way to give credits where it is due. And for what counts as story, I think salmon's migrations or like forest fire, all of these are kind of narrative, but it is an invisible one, at least to the human perceptions, because not everyone have this knowledge about environmental humanities. So what we need is not just imagination alone, but also better tools. And I believe with the help of technologies, we will be able to visualize or hear more clearly the non-human voices around us, and through that communicate them on a deeper levels. And yeah, the idea of storytelling require language still hold, but I believe non-human entities like trees, they do have intentions and language, and it's just that we some of us have not feel that yet, and perhaps that's the most important lessons. Uh, I think every school should have it actually. Yeah, so that's my answer for yes.
Thank you. Thank you. As we move to a close here, I just want to invite my other co-host, Mildred, if there's anything that you want to add before we wrap things up.
I think we've really covered everything and in such a short time. But one thing I will mention, there was a question about how indigenous perspectives can also be in eco-literature. So I don't want to leave that untouched because I do believe that we are here, maybe because we've actually read a lot of indigenous perspectives on ecolit, which is to live, how to live in communion with land as a breathing, living entity, how to recognize the multi-species as as not just a part of us, but as who we are, and the symbiotic nature of these relationships. So I do want to say that I think the killing and eating of animals, what's condemned is really the industry, the massive killings that tend to be reckless and also end up really wasting a lot. But when if you've read, and I'm sure all of you have read indigenous literature about the treatment of eating plants and eating animals, but and sharing all that with your community, how you may need just one bull a year to feed the entire village, and how that kind of living, or the time that it happened in the past when communities were sharing. I don't think there was a lot of destruction, in terms of environment, but the kind of destructive behavior that we see in the Anthropocene, which is the colonial, which is the taking over, which is like this right that we are here above the food chain and we need to destroy everything that's not walking on two legs. I think that's mostly what we don't agree with and what we are here to challenge. And I'm sure there are other, perspectives, indigenous perspectives that we have not covered that we could bring into the conversation. So the more diversity, the better for us. And this is a process of learning. We're just tapping into it.
Mhm, mhm. Well said. Thank you so much, Mildred. So thank you to all of our guests. Thank you, Boria. Thank you, John. Thank you, Midge. Thank you, Lesley. Thank you, Lay, for all of your time here. And thank you for everyone who joined us too. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Multispecies Connections. And I just want to say that you can listen to previous episodes and previous seasons here of the ASLE Spotlight series on ASLE's website casts. So thank you all so much for joining us today.